so much for joining us here tonight for our event, Monumental Racists, a conversation about challenging, reframing, and removing statues. I'm Dr. Lyra Montero, and I'm the creator of Washington's Next, the project that is the occasion for tonight's conversation. But of course, the conversation is very, very much bigger than this project. And I'm so honored that Jack Chen and Marisa Williamson have chosen to join me tonight for exploring the bigger issues that Washington's Next has been engaging with for the past 6 months or so. But before we get into the conversation itself, I wanted to make sure to thank the sponsors of tonight's panel, which are the Department of History and the Clement A. Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. And I'd also like to encourage you to please feel free, or maybe even encourage you to more than just feel free, to tweet or otherwise post on social media about tonight's panel, about anything that we are talking about, and to also please use the hashtag Washington's Next so that we can continue the conversation. And now, some of you may be holding a little handout that doesn't make a whole lot of sense just yet. And in order to get us started with a brief overview of Washington's Next, and which the meaning of this handout will become clear, I'd like to introduce Sydney Johnson. Sydney is a first-year student in our American Studies PhD program, but already an accomplished public historian. In addition to her MA in Public History from American University, she has worked at a number of museums and historic sites, including the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, President Lincoln's Cottage, and was most recently the curator of exhibits at the Missouri State Museum. I have been extremely fortunate to have been able to work with her as my graduate assistant this semester, particularly on this project, Washington's Next. And she is in fact the perfect person, therefore, to introduce you to the project.
Good evening. As Dr. Montero said, my name is Sydney Johnson, and I've come to more deeply understand the complex relationships between public memory and monuments via my work with Washington's Next as her graduate assistant. Washington's Next was conceptualized as a response to President Trump's tweets following the 2017 Charlottesville riots. Specifically, this tweet that you will see on the screen. Can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington? Jefferson, so foolish. Now, this rhetorical question added to conversations being had nation and worldwide about who contested monuments honored and what groups were being marginalized and silenced in this process. Washington's Next aimed to enter and complicate these conversations by synthesizing art, media, and history to explore these timely questions. The museum on site, a public humanities and art project that produces site-specific free public experiences led by Dr. Lyra Montero, developed Washington's Next as a public art intervention at the base of George Washington's statue in Union Square Park to recast him from hero to enslaver and to reaffirm the humanity of the hundreds of Black women, men, and children he enslaved at the time the statue depicts. Though work of this kind is necessary, it can understandably be controversial, and it would not have been possible without the support of institutions dedicated to social change and publicly engaged work. Support provided by various offices at the university were crucial to the success of the project, as was structural support from the Art in Odd Places Festival, which the theme of this year was Body. As part of the annual festivities that take place along New York City's 14th Street, Washington's Next was granted a broader sense of legitimacy that proved essential when passerbys and law enforcement inquired about our right to occupy public space for such a long period of time. Now, in today's age of digital networks, we found it paramount to create some sort of online presence for Washington's Next prior to our October 13th commemoration. Twitter, Instagram, and GoFundMe were the three platforms used to present the project's goal of decentering Washington and amplifying the Black voices of the people he enslaved, while engaging in conversations with followers about the project's historical context and contemporary relevance. And you can see two of our Instagram posts featured on the screen. We chose to be very hashtag heavy to make sure that if people did choose to interact with us in that way, that we could easily track their engagement. But Union Square Park proved to be an extremely relevant site for a public intervention that was sure to garner attention with or without a social media plan, mainly for two reasons. First, it's centrally located in Manhattan. It serves as a major subway hub and a natural gathering place for individuals and various groups. Second, as these images depict, it has a long history as a site of protest, making it an ideal spot to host a commemoration and intervention of this kind. Now, it can be difficult to actually spot the statue in these pictures because of all the landscaping and the shrubbery, but it's kind of set back in the background. You'll see Washington up on a pedestal, right there in the center where those protests are actually happening. So a perfect spot for activism to erupt spontaneously. On Saturday, October 13th, we arrived on site to prepare for the commemoration. A commissioned painting was created by Newark-based artist Jay Quinlan and was displayed beneath the statue. It stood as an artistic interpretation of the commemoration's premise and overall message. It prominently featured the number 271 to represent the 271 people that Washington enslaved on November 25th, 1783, the date that he is depicted in this statue. The artist also intentionally painted Washington's silhouette with muted colors in the background. Volunteers began setting up chalkboards at the base of the statue. Chalkboards were chosen to symbolize the 271 Black people disembodied by Washington's enslavement of them, and the subsequent silencing or erasure of their presence from the historical record and from public memory. For a span of time, the chalkboards sat empty, with nothing written on them. The absence of meaning allowed people to analyze and interrogate the space and the numerous blank canvases before them. Nearly 15 volunteers were present to engage participants in conversation about the commemorative display and to disseminate literature, like the pamphlets you have in hand. Now, these pamphlets were specifically designed for this on-site experience. They were used to answer the inevitable questions posed by passersby. What are you all doing here in this specific park? Why is this display called Washington's Next? And of course, am I allowed to do anything with what I see before me? Now, it's important to remember that since Washington's Next was a guerrilla-style intervention, the people who encountered it were random New Yorkers going about their days. And because of this, people had a wide range of reactions. The most common response was shock. He had that many slaves? Now, beyond shock, many people were actually open to reconsidering their notions about the infallibility of George Washington and the importance of commemorating the mere existence of those he oppressed. Others were very resistant and unwilling to confront their own bias. When viewing the commemoration, some people resorted to the "he was a man of his time" argument, and that, of course, allowed for more fruitful discussions to flow. Next, the commemoration transitioned into its participatory phase. Interested parties were invited to choose a biography of an enslaved person, read it, and write that person's name on a chalkboard of their choice, effectively doing their small part in honoring that person's existence and unerasing them from popular memory and American history. Participants chose biographies for many reasons. An enslaved person had the same name as a loved one. They knew a person the same age as the enslaved person in the biography that they chose. Or the short life story that they read simply resonated with them. Each of the 271 biographies was written using data mined from the extensive archives of George Washington's records scattered around the nation. What participants participants chose to write on their chalkboards demonstrated the various ways they extracted meaning from the biography they chose to read and the commemoration as a whole. Epitaphs, drawings, and the names of loved ones mentioned in the biographies were common to see written on the boards. Phrases assigning value to the enslaved were also prominent, such as the ones you see displayed here. A particular chalkboard read, "Your life mattered," beneath the name. In that instance, the participant chose to make an explicit connection to the modern movement for Black lives. However, not everyone who encountered the display chose to participate. Some simply read the biographies. Others asked questions. Some even took pictures on their own and then went about their day. The commemoration lasted well into the evening. With technical difficulties. All right. The commemoration lasted well into the evening, with people continuing to engage with the displayed content even as we began to disassemble it. A chalkboard was not unerased for each of the 271 enslaved people. Some of the chalkboards stood empty for the entirety of the commemoration. But this speaks to the stories we cannot tell and the sheer unknowability of the experience of being enslaved. As mentioned before, social media served as a way for us to engage audiences prior to the physical commemoration, and it continues to be an integral part of Washington's Next as an ever-evolving public intervention. As part of our evaluation process, we tracked the hashtag Washington's Next on social media, and it was being used up to a week after the commemoration. Washington's Next had a calculable impact that extended beyond its initial site specificity. The particular chalkboard that you see on the screen was posted via Instagram by a person who encountered the display. In a caption, the participant who posted this image wrote, "While the chalkboard plaques were gone several hours later, Boatswain and Alice are a part of my memory now, and part of my experience of walking by that statue in my beloved park. There is no personage, institution, or collective myth too sacred to question." And I think that's a perfect way to sum up the lasting impact of Washington's Next. Now, if you'll take a second, digest all of that information, and join me in welcoming the moderator of this panel, Dr. Aaliyah Brown. Aaliyah Brown is a public historian, curator, and writer. She is currently the program manager for, the program manager for the Climate and Environmental Justice Humanities Action Lab and a Mellon ACLS Public Fellow. Her research explores Black women's textiles as vehicles in the Black struggle for freedom. With Marsha McDowell, she curated Ubuntu, Life Legacies of Love and Action, and co-authored the exhibition catalog by the same name. She is also the co-curator of two acclaimed digital humanities projects, hashtag Museums Respond to Ferguson, and hashtag Black Twitter Stories. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aaliyah Brown.
And thank you all for being here this evening. We're really excited about this panel, and we'll get into it. So, a lot of the times, my historical curiosity starts with visual art and poetry. So I thought that I would open up this panel with talking about one of June Jordan's reflections. So, reflecting on the built environment in New York City, poet and activist June Jordan asked, "Is there an honorable means towards mourning and remembering who and what we have loved?" Contemplating even further, she asked, "Is there an honorable means to pursue and capture perpetrators of atrocity without ourselves becoming terrorists?" The question she posed required two types of commitment. One, a faithfulness to the archive and historical records, which sometimes diverge from collective memory, as some of our panelists will talk about in a few moments. and another faithfulness to justice, to listening to the voices of the oppressed and honoring their experiences. Tonight, our panelists will explore racist monuments with special attention to how the United States has memorialized its first president, George Washington, to how museums have exhibited and preserved relics of white supremacy. So you'll hear kind of many different types of monuments and the reactions to them. So our first panelist is Jack Chin. He is a historian, curator, and writer. Professor Chin is the inaugural Clement A. Price Chair of Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University, New York, and director of the Clement Price Institute of Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience since fall 2018. He is the founding director of the Asian Pacific American Studies Program and Institute and part of the founding faculty of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. He co-founded the Museum of Chinese in America in 1979, where he continues to serve as senior historian. He is also the founder of the newly formed New York Public History Project, funded by the Ford Foundation, which will reframe the history of the Estoril region, starting with the twined foundational histories of dispossession and enslavement. His Below the Grid project is exploring creative historical storytelling with smart, location-sensitive wearable tech. So please welcome Jack Chin. Then our next panelist is Marisa Williamson. She is a New York metro area-based multimedia artist. She has created site-specific works and in collaboration with the University of Virginia, Mural Arts Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, Storm King Art Center, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her videos, performances, and installations have been exhibited internationally. She received her BA from Harvard University and her MFA from Cal Arts. She was a participant in the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2012 and the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program in 2014. She is taught at the Pratt Institute, the Brooklyn Museum, and Rutgers University's Mason Gross School of the Arts. She is currently on faculty at the Hartford Art School at the University of Hartford. So please welcome Marisa. And then finally, we have Lyra Monteiro. She is assistant professor in Department of History in the graduate program in American Studies and affiliate faculty in the Department of African American and African Studies at Rutgers University, New York. Her work focuses on the uses of the past in public culture, with a particular emphasis on issues of race, representation, and telling the history of the United States past. Her review essay in the Public Historian titled Race-Conscious Casting and the Erasure of the Black Past and Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton argued that despite its celebrated multiracial casting, the play reinforces the idea that the United States past was populated solely by white people, thus normalizing and legitimizing white power in the present. Her current public art project, which we're talking about tonight, Washington's Next, responds to President Trump's post-Charlottesville tweet that said, as you all saw earlier, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish. So with that, please welcome Lyra Monteiro. Okay, great. So I first wanted to give you all a chance to talk a little bit about your own work and your experience and how that may connect to the built environment and how we commemorate in the public history of monuments. So Jack, do you want to go first?
Hello everybody. My voice is a little congested, so excuse me. I thought I'd maybe talk a little bit about my involvement on the New York Mayor's Commission on Monuments, just briefly because it's a long story, and what came out of that, and therefore what I'm bringing to this campus. I'm hoping to engage many people here with. Last fall, a 90-day commission was set up by Mayor Bill de Blasio, and he invited 15 or so people to serve on the commission for 90 days to come up with some kind of policy, guidelines about monuments, markers, and public art in New York City. It was a kind of crazy proposition because how can that be done in 90 days? We were not even given a list of the monuments that are in the city. There were 5 public hearings corresponding to each of the boroughs, and each of our meetings, or 3 meetings, were about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and by the last meeting, we were expected to make a judgment about four markers monuments. They included, many of you know, the Petain marker, that's on Broadway, where supposedly it's the Valley of Heroes, where there's a ticker tape parade, and whoever got a ticker tape parade at any given year has a marker on Broadway. Also, Columbus Circle, which includes, of course, the Columbus Column Monument with Columbus on top and the circle itself. The Teddy Roosevelt statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History, and also the Marion Sims, excuse me, thank you. My head is very cloudy right now. Marion Sims Monument, who was considered a founding patriarch of American gynecology, but also, of course, experimented in African American women in particular. So we were supposed to take the guidelines that we set up at the first meeting and begin to apply them to these 4 monuments and markers. And it was actually an impossible task, in part because we had barely known each other, and we didn't actually have prep material. So in some ways, as a public history project, it was actually a great failure because we didn't do the preparation properly to actually have the information that we needed to actually have an intelligent discussion. We were split on a number of them. So Marion Sims, we did vote to have it removed, and it now is sitting in somewhere in Greenwood Cemetery near my house, where a number of public monuments seem to go, including Public Virtue, which is another monument that had been moved. And we were deadlocked on 2 of the monuments, the Columbus Circle Monument Columbus, and also the Teddy Roosevelt Monument. The Petain was another discussion, so I'm happy to go into all of those. But since we don't really have much time, I'll just say that in the debates and discussions that we had, a number of us were reflecting on the fact that unless the cities begins to tell, New York City begins to tell a different story about itself, other than simply inclusion, or simply that we're all a city of immigrants, or that we're a pluralist place, and therefore the argument that began to come out of that was that as a pluralist place, we should just add more monuments and markers and public art, as opposed to take anything away. So there's different lines of argument that were being made. I voted, just so you know very quickly, to remove the Columbus monument and also to remove Teddy Roosevelt. Both of them are more complex situations, but in fact, all four of these examples are expressions of a yet unacknowledged way in which these monuments were deeply entwined with a moment of eugenics and scientific racism in the history of the city. Never did we have enough time to actually engage and discuss that. But in particular, a number of us felt that this whole story of the city of being immigrants and pluralism was really floating unless it was grounded with the fundamental question of dispossession and enslavement. So those were the 2 kind of key issues that a number of us were really maintaining. Now, oddly, out of this process, one of the co-chairs was Darren Walker, who's the head of the Ford Foundation. He picked up on, he picked up on that question and said he wanted to provide a seed grant to form a new research project around those 2 very questions. So the New York Public History Project is about that. And I can kind of briefly tell you about that, but I don't want to take up too much time. How much maybe
You can take about 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, okay.
We'll
I'll
have
try
more
to do
time.
that. Okay, thank you. So we're actually extending the incredible map that Eric Sanderson, many of you know of the book Manhattan, which Eric Sanderson, who's a wildlife ecologist, has created the best guess that he has as an ecologist of what Manhattan and now the 5 boroughs likely looked like 2 hours before Henry Hudson arrived in New York in 1609. So if you go onto the website Wallachia, you'll actually be able to toggle back and forth between any given block in Manhattan for the moment, but eventually all 5 boroughs, and actually what that same parcel of land looked like in 1609. What he has generously agreed to collaborate with us on is to extend that into a historical database, so we can actually begin to demonstrate and show and illustrate, really to visualize, how dispossession actually happened immediately after 1609. And by the mid-1700s, in fact, the whole region, including New Jersey, which is kind of the key kind of home fires, place of home fires of the Lenape peoples, were essentially were either decimated from disease or from extreme horrible violence. Kiff's Massacre in 1643 is kind of a key event in which dispossession happened, but also dispossession of a way of life and a dispossession of the ability to sustain the culture. So as Lenape moved on the area. So what we've done to set that up, and I'll just wrap up here. So the question is, how do you begin a project like that? And the reality is that Lenape peoples, as many of you know, have been moved and pushed out of the region. Those who survived that horrible period of time. There's 2 groups, the Ramapo and the Nanticoke, who are still in the region, and then other groups have been pushed to Wisconsin, to Canada, to Oklahoma. So what we just did recently, we used some of that monies to bring a number of about seven territories, leaders from the 7 territories, back together in this region to actually begin a process of engaging with what does it mean to have this region be telling the story by Lenape about that story that has been largely invisibilized and disappeared. That becomes the basis of how then we feel we can begin this new mapping kind of project. So many of you may realize the powwow just happened at the Park Avenue Armory, and that was the most public representation. That it was called the first United Lenape Nations powwow. And it was very powerful to have those elders that we invited to actually lead the grand procession into the space. And then right before the actual powwow, we spent 2.5 days of convening and talking and really having them decide whether they wanted to share their story and begin to document that story together. So we're now they're having agreed, and we're now doing that collaboration. So that's the beginning of how we're trying to reckon with this problem. And just to end, the Native American groups that we've spoken to have said they don't really want a monument. Although there are some people who said, you know, a certain kind of monument might be okay, but they'd much rather have investment of the city on actual spaces for them to operate. New York City, but if we were to extend the region, really has the largest metropolitan region, largest number of Native Americans, indigenous peoples in North America. And that is virtually invisible in terms of organizational, institutional space.
Thank you for having me. This is cool. And I approach this as an artist. I think my first beginnings of thinking about monuments really happened through performance and being drawn to the figure of Sally Hemings as someone who was kind of an empty vessel into which people, or onto which people were projecting. And as a grad student, I kept returning to her story, especially through the text of Annette Gordon-Reed. I returned to Annette Gordon-Reed's text because she had, for the first time, psychologized a historical figure who I'd never seen psychologized before. So, of course, Jefferson gets narratives where, you know, he loves macaroni and cheese and sleeping late and riding horses, and I'd never seen anyone approach an enslaved person that way. And so I started to make work where I embodied Sally Hemings, and at first went to Monticello's I'd asked permission, kind of, but I think part of the strategy of my performance art is to kind of not give too much information until the performance is actually happening. So I went to Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, and kind of brought Sally Hemings to life there, and was interested in questions of ghosts and haunting and what it means for a contemporary artist to feel resonance, to feel like something actually, moving through your body and then bringing that movement to a place and trying to kind of draw attention to the landscape there and who's been absented there. So I had been doing that work. I did that work for about 4 years, and I think it drew the attention of a project in Philadelphia, Monument Lab, which was a project where artists were commissioned to make alternative monuments, monument prototypes for the city of Philadelphia, and that's the city where I'm from. So I was very, very excited to be invited to kind of return home and think about what that city could use. And I was invited to explore this space called Wekaco Playground, which had been discovered to be an enslaved or free African-American burial ground. It was now a playground, though. So I was trying to think through proposals at that point about what should go there. And I came up with this augmented reality smartphone app after kind of being shut down around building literal, material monuments. And that kind of opened me up as a digital artist, in addition to being a performance artist, to the ways that people can engage with space that aren't about looking up at a figure, but instead kind of looking around and peeking through doorways, augmented reality doorways, following maps, scratch off, finding their ticket to freedom through the narratives of people who've come before. So that was, every time I do something, I'm doing it for the first time. And that one was a really great opportunity to figure out how technology could kind of supplant the built tall thing and find other ways to bring history face to face. And then I got an opportunity to go back to Charlottesville and be a visiting artist at UVA. And for me, I was like, this is an opportunity to maybe leave Sally Hemings where I picked her up. And so I went down there, and it was the spring after the fall, after the summer of the Charlottesville kind of Unite the Right. I don't even know what to call that thing. Charlottesville. And that was what felt really heavy, was that the name of a town that I like had become synonymous with this kind of make America something again. There was it's become a battleground for what it means to want to revive the past. And I've been invested, of course, in the last few years in reviving the past, but in order to jostle, break us free, remind us of, kind of bring back the ghosts of the past, the haunt, as I say, unsettle the settlers. But I now had, it seemed, kind of a real obstacle, a real opposition, a real kind of foe in a practice that had otherwise been kind of about institution and whiteness as it pervades academic and creative thinking. So there, let's see,